So the project here at An Caora Dubh Farm really has been one giant science experiment, poking around with nature's processes and seeing what works within our specific context. I've got a particular passion for trees on the landscape. Historically, this landscape would have been would have had a vast amount of tree cover that's been eroded and eaten and taken away over the last 200 or 300 years or so. And one of the main objectives of the project here is to re-establish a lot of that cover. And in the course of this presentation, I hope to illuminate some of you as to why that might be a good thing on our farms, particularly in light of a changing climate. But before we get to trees, I'd like to talk about paradigms. This idea that so a paradigm is basically an unrecognized belief system that we may all hold. We may not. It's very likely that we're not aware of them, but it's important that as we develop and as we consider our longer term impacts of management decisions on farms, that that we try to tune into what our paradigms may be and to challenge them whenever possible. So this, in this, the first part of this presentation, I'm going to be speaking about what it means to be managing a landscape holistically. I'm going to give you a brief introduction into the soil food web, the biological soil food web, and what that means in terms of natural succession in our wet temperate biome here on the Atlantic margin. We'll then move on to speak more specifically about the roles of trees within functioning ecosystems. We'll look at a couple of examples of agroforestry in the Irish context. And then I'll give you some practical insights into how you might go about thinking about developing an agroforestry design for your own farms. You guys are the future, so hopefully I'm hoping at least some of you, this will set a seed for at least some of you, that you might want to go away and begin looking at your own operations differently in the years to come. So holistic management is a term that was the product of this guy called Alan Savory, and Alan developed this concept or began developing this concept of holistic management in the 60s and 70s when he was a newly qualified ecologist straight out of uni. His first role was with the National Park Service in Zimbabwe and in parts of South Africa, managing these big game reserves. One of the big patterns that Alan was able to notice on a global level was that 2/3 of the earth was currently desert or is desertifying, and that's a trend that is intensified to this day. And he began asking the question why. And in some of his early work products, the general consensus at the time, the paradigm, if you will, among some of his learned colleagues was that overgrazing was the issue, was the reason why the large parts of the globe were suffering this loss of vegetation, broken water cycles, and encroachment of deserts. And of course, this has broader socio-economic impacts in the world. We see this at the moment, where in what was once the breadbasket of the world in this region, what we call the Middle East, which is where the original Garden of Eden was on the banks of the Euphrates in southern Iraq, is now nothing but a dust bowl. And we need to begin asking ourselves, why is that? Why is it that the very early area on the planet where agriculture and an agrarian existence was initially born was one of the first areas to desertify? And of course, we're seeing the fallout of that today with massive immigration from this region due to civil unrest, social unrest, a collapse of ecosystems that ultimately means that people can't produce food or have consistent and secure supplies of water. So one of the early products from Alan's work was a report that recommended they cull one of the largest herds of, or part of the largest herds of elephants down in South Africa. And off the back of that recommendation, which was peer reviewed within the existing paradigm at the time, they went out and shot 40,000 elephants. And then, like all good scientists, they observed the product of that work, and realizing that the problem of desertification in their local region had actually got worse, not got better. So they, with the typical, I like to call it a moron philosophy. If enough doesn't work, pour more on. They sanctioned another cull and shot a further 40,000 elephants. So after 80,000 of these large roaming herbivores and all of their knock-on effects had been removed from the landscape, do you think it got better? No. The answer is no. The problem continued to be exacerbated. So Alan then turned around and kind of devoted his life to defining this new framework, if you like, called holistic management, which was beginning to understand how our own actions within complex systems can result in really severe unintended consequences. And the key to all of this, as he realized, is soil carbon, our ability to recognize that nature's own innate mechanisms are in place, which allow us to cycle water, carbon, and energy through these ecosystems. So holistic management is simply a decision-making framework that helps us balance the economic, ecological, and social soundness of decisions. Core to the holistic management framework are 4 key insights. The first is that nature functions in wholes. So not only is the world more complex than we understand, but it's more complex than we can ever understand. Now, this quote basically means that when we incorrectly try to, with all the good intentions in the world, when we apply the right tools to the wrong job or the wrong tools to the right job, it can end up with disastrous consequences. And what it means in this context is that if you consider a typical scientific approach to problem solving, what we do is we take a very, very complex system. We consider the variables that we're looking to study, and as much as possible, or as far as possible, we try to isolate those variables and disregard any kind of outside interference from third or fourth or fifth order connections within a system. And then we play around. We mess with the dials. You know, we change the energy flows coming in and out of this system. We change water cycles. We change community dynamics, and we see what happens. The trouble is this reductionist approach, this approach of narrowing the field of view at all times, really leads us down a path where we end up causing huge harm at one end of the spectrum, perhaps even unknowingly to ourselves. So the primary observation that nature functions in wholes is one that really instills a kind of humble approach from us. If you consider the human body as well, when a doctor, a traditional doctor or a conventional doctor, if you like, would approach a particular issue, he may look at one particular problem in isolation. For example, an inflamed joint, might choose to select some appropriate medication just to treat that particular issue. But the risk of this reductionist approach is that you never truly get to the root cause of what's actually causing the inflammation in the first place. So it could be akin to taking an aspirin for a sore head whilst continuing to hit yourself over the head with a bat. The second key insight is the brittleness scale. And this is basically an expression of year-round humidity. So how well distributed throughout the course of 12 months or 4 seasons the humidity profile is in the different regions of the world. So on one extreme, on the right-hand side there, a brittleness scale of 10 would be something like the Atacama Desert or the regions of Mauritania, the Northern Sahara, where you have very, very little rainfall at all. And on the left-hand side there, you've got something like a hot, humid, temperate rainforest zone, such as you might find in the north of Brazil or in parts of Indonesia, where you pretty much have, 90% humidity or above for 365 days of the year. Now, what this means for us as land managers and land custodians is that the tools that we choose to apply to these different landscapes will have different effects. So the same tool, the right tool or the wrong tool, depending on our objectives, will have completely different outcomes depending on where we are on this brittleness scale, where our site is on this brittleness scale. And if you consider Donegal with its being the Atlantic margin, cool temperate climate zone, we're probably sitting at somewhere around a 2 or a 3 on the scale. The third key insight is the predator-prey relationship. So when we're thinking about how nature does things, that's always the question we're trying to ask. You know, what would nature do? We're trying to tap into 3.5 billion years of research and development and trying to learn from it. When you bear in mind that the agrarian existence within the human context is somewhere in the region of 10,000 or somewhere in the region of 6,000 years old. And most of the developments that we would come to know as modern agriculture today have happened in the last 70 or 80 years. There's really a bigger game at play here that we really need to begin paying attention to. So the predator-prey relationship in particular is a key mechanism with how nature manages nutrient cycles within large grassland systems. If you think back, I'm sure we've all seen those famous helicopter shots of David Attenborough from those TV shows from like the Serengeti and the like. These herbivores, the only protection they do have against predators is to keep bunched together and to keep moving. The presence of predators means that the animals behave in that particular way. Because they're bunched, it's safer to be on the very inside of the pack than it is to be on the outside. So they're constantly moving, and the result of that is that they're constantly trampling biomass down into the soil surface and covering it with a layer of dung and urine, essentially composting biomass in place. So by the time these gigantic herds move on, because they have to move on in order to get some fresh food, by the time they move on, they've essentially created this huge, deep litter mulch bed across the soil surface, which acts as armor. It protects the sun from rain, so we're minimizing the risk of erosion. It also protects the soil surface from big temperature fluctuations, so you'll typically find that the soil surface underneath these litter zones are cooler during the day and warmer at night, which basically gives you a more consistent band for seed germination and for biological activity to break down some of that biomass. And then the third key aspect, or the fourth key aspect of this system is timing is everything. So when you bunch animals together, when you bunch herbivores together with the predator-prey relationship and keep them moving, by nature of the fact that they're moving on, the ground is getting an opportunity to rest. Therefore, grasslands are recovering. The example given in a lot of the holistic management training is imagine you lived at the top of a hill and your only water source was at the bottom of a hill, and your only means of transporting your daily water needs back up to your house was a donkey. And if you would take your donkey down to the bottom of the hill every day, fill up 2 flasks of water and walk it back up the hill, you can imagine the state of that singular path over the course of a year. Now flip the equation on its head and imagine you had, for argument's sake, 365 donkeys. You would bring them down to the bottom of the hill in one shot, load them up in one shot, and bring them back up to the top of your hill with your year's water supply. The path between the 2 points would then have 364 days to recover. Now, I'm sure it's a very easy thought experiment to understand what the difference of impact there is. It's essentially the same number of journeys, just carried out in very, very different ways. That points to this fourth key insight, is that timing is everything. So it's not necessarily the simplistic kind of relationship between how many animals do we have per acre, how many animals do we have per hectare, but the equation that's often overlooked in conventional pasture management is how much recovery time are we giving to our grasses once we've grazed them. And this begins to form the basis of more broadly accepted ideas around the concept of mob grazing. So this is a couple of examples here of pictures from some projects that were managed holistically. The left-hand picture here is from 1974. The right one is the exact same scene from 2013. Climate hasn't changed in the intervening 30 years, 40 years. What has changed? Well, actually, the big change between the left panel and the right panel is that the stocking rate in this scene has gone up by 5x. So they're carrying 5 times the amount of animals on it than they did in 1974. And the other key difference is they're bunching them together and moving them. So how we interact with the landscape is very often far more important, or how we manage our livestock to interact with the landscape is very often far more important than the number of head, for example. Whenever we interact with the landscape, we need to consider the tools that are in our armory. What do we have available to use? Initially, we might consider that we only have a few options available to us. But if you give yourself some time and begin to apply the most important tool, which is human creativity, you begin to recognize that our options and our combination of options are actually quite a lot. But they're born from these kind of 5 key areas. Technology is a fairly obvious one in the form of tractors, but also perhaps not as obvious is the use of technology in the form of herbicides, pesticides, and artificial fertilizers. Fire is a tool that's actually older than agriculture. It was used before the dawn of the agrarian resistance 6,000 years ago. And it's still used today. You know, you see it on the grouse moors of Scotland. You see it intentionally or otherwise in West Donegal these last few years as well. You know, farmers would typically burn off heather in order to stimulate ground into that kind of sweeter green bud that we're all after. And obviously there are huge knock-on effects, negative consequences to that. Rest is also a tool that we need to consider. So doing nothing is actually an option as well. And we all know what happens in our wet temperate landscape when ground is left fallow for too long. The big tools that we have as farmers are living organisms. Now there are 2 on this list, 2 tools. Animal impact, that's quite literally the hoof of animals. And the animal impact is dictated not just by the ratio between weight and hoof area, but also the psychology of the animal. When you bunch animals together into a tight group, such as mimicking that predator-prey relationship that we spoke about earlier on, the psychology changes. The number of times they put their hoof down in a minute changes, and you begin increasing that trampling effect. So hooves are a real key tool for us, as well as along with the psychology, and also the digestive tract of that animal as well. So what goes in at one end and comes out the other has a huge bearing on the quality and health of our nutrient cycles within these grassland systems. The third part of that, which I'm going to touch on briefly in the next section, is the biological soil food web. So these are the microscopic creatures that live below our feet and indeed on the surface of our skin, and are currently causing so many issues in the world at the moment. And all of these are underpinned by human endeavor in the form of money and labor. So by selecting the appropriate tool from this use, depending upon our current situation and objectives, combining it with money and labor and creativity, we can really begin to realize that there are a million ways to skin a cat. A second concept I'd like to introduce you to, or a second and third concept I'd like to introduce you to, is this idea of systems thinking. When we think about linear systems, we think about, those typical supply chain models that you will undoubtedly have seen, where you take raw materials at one end of the chain, you add value to it, you take it through some form of processing perhaps, or maybe you grow a seed into a plant, or you take a ram and combine it with a ewe and grow a lamb. And then you go through this process of resource conversion where you're feeding that organism, be it a plant or a unit of livestock. You go through a marketing conversion, and then eventually you get your yield out the other end, which is money. Now that linear system is very typical of modern approach to business, and indeed has been perhaps overused when it comes to us considering how man should interact with natural systems. Nature doesn't function in linear systems. It functions in wholes and functions in a circular manner, such that nature doesn't create waste. For example, the output from one system becomes the raw material, the input for the next system. And so we refer back to that first point that was that first key insight of holistic management, which is that nature functions nature functions in wholes, and indeed wholes within wholes. So there are small systems at play which each come together to form part of a larger whole, which then scales up. The other concept here is this idea of complicated system versus complex. Now, the two pictures you have on the screen there. One is of a very fine Swiss watch, which is in component pieces. We can imagine the ingenuity, the research and development, the fine motor skills, the craftsmanship indeed that has to go into making such an accurate and beautiful timepiece. But were we to remove a single element of that system, of that complicated system, the whole thing would essentially be a big shiny paperweight, and it would in no way at all function its original intended purpose. Nature doesn't work with complicated systems. It prefers complex systems, such as the soil food web. So within a soil food web or within a complex system, any particular element of that system, when removed from the whole, the system rebalances. And we give this, we call this term resilience. So the ability for a system to absorb external stimulus, dissipate that energy, and reform itself and reorganize itself without any external help to still keep on performing its original function. In modern agriculture, with our drive towards economies of scale and our ever increasing chase of efficiency has driven us more and more down the route of monocultures. We're told that by managing single species or low diversity grassland, that it's easier for us. But in actual fact, if we look at it on a broader picture, it's easier for us in the short scale, but the longer term impacts are pretty severe. Every time we plow and reseed a seed, for example, we're interrupting a water cycle, we're interrupting a biological soil food web, we're liberating carbon into the atmosphere, and we're losing soil in the form of erosion. So that's just one example within modern agriculture of how we're chasing complicated systems under the misnomer of efficiency, and what we really should be doing, perhaps, is looking to embrace complexity and diversity. So as I said to you earlier on, I got into farming. I grew up on the farm here, and trained as an engineer, and then I left when I was about 19, and I worked in oil and gas exploration, dealing with very, very complicated systems in different parts of the globe, managing technical issues, but also interpersonal and social issues. Worked in some really nice places and some really not so nice places as well. And I began to realize that actually everything I was doing, every minute of my day was spent kind of fighting against nature at every single turn. And then about 6 years ago, I came across Alan Savory's TED Talk, which set off a light bulb in my head. And then the nail in that coffin for me was the work of Dr. Elaine Ingham in the soil food web. Dr. Elaine Ingham is a soil scientist from Minnesota, and she has about coming up on 50 years experience now in the whole game. And for the last 30 or 35 years, she's been working really to challenge the existing paradigm within the modern understanding of soil health. So if you ask anybody, or if you ask most people involved with any kind of land management or indeed forms of agriculture, what the key components of soil are, will often tell you about the chemical soil analysis. They'll be able to tell you about what are bioavailable nutrients and what are bio-unavailable. They're able to tell you what's soluble and insoluble. They might even talk about the mineralogy of soil and the grain particle distribution, and how that impacts how we how we interact with our landscapes. But very often the overlooked part of it is the biological soil food web. And Dr. Elaine's work kind of breaks down into this. So it's recognizing that there are different trophic levels, not just above ground, but also below ground, that play a very key role in cycling nutrients, minerals, and indeed water through the system. And earlier on, I spoke about nature having 3.5 billion years of research and development on us. And that's very true. When you look at, in the modern world, when you look at systems, for example, like a mature pocket of native woodland, that and when you step in through it, the amount of biomass being generated there is just incredible. And nobody is tending to it. Nobody is applying bagged fertilizer. Nobody's in there digging drains. We need to begin asking ourselves the question, how is this system so abundant, so productive, and so resilient without any external input, where across the fence we can have a farm that has diminishing levels of productivity with increasing inputs year on year? The answer I would pose is that we're not mimicking nature. We're not taking advantage of that 3.5 billion years of R&D that's in front of us. So you can see here at the within the soil food web, we have these different trophic levels. So everything from sort of macro, these larger animals that you can see with our naked eye, down to arthropods, microarthropods, nematodes, protozoa, fungi, bacteria. These are the guys that you can that aren't really visible to aren't visible at all to the naked eye and need to be seen under magnification, under microscopes. But the term that's often bandied around is that in 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, that is a soil with a functioning soil food web, with all of the indigenous species represented local to that area. Within 1 teaspoon of healthy soil, there are more organisms within that 1 teaspoon than there are people on planet Earth. And that's no mean feat, given the fact that we're knocking on for 7 billion people on the planet at the moment. That's billion with a B. The other key insight here from Elaine Ingham was she began to recognize that there was a very distinct ratio between the volume or the amount of bacteria within a soil sample and the amount of fungi, and that depending on that particular ratio, it pointed towards what stage in succession the broader ecosystem was at. And another product of her work was this graphic here. If we consider on the left-hand side of the graphic here, we have bare ground. So consider it a ploughed field after you've just gone through it. Maybe you've ploughed and harrowed it. So you've knocked everything back, you've turned the sod over, you've now exposed organisms that have evolved away from ultraviolet sunlight to UV radiation, and they've oxidized and gone off. So you've burnt up a huge carbon store within your soil. You've removed any armor from your soil, so you've now exposed it to the full process of weathering from wind and from sun and from rain. And in our climate, the do-nothing scenario, well, in fact, in most climates around the world, almost 70 or 80% of them, the do-nothing scenario from that bare ground state is that nature will continue its march towards the right-hand side. So on a long enough timeline, our bare ground will succeed through early weed species with high bacterial dominance in the soil, through to grassland, through to early stage woody shrub succession, then pioneer woodland, and then eventually onto old growth woodland. And we can see here, as we move from left to right, the bacterial fungal ratio across these various stages also shift. So on the left here, we have a hugely bacterially dominated soil, and on the right, we have a hugely fungal dominated soil. So whenever, if we understand then that the do-nothing scenario in our climate, and remember, do-nothing is the equivalent of applying the tool of rest, which is also a choice. Nature will, from the moment disturbance stops, continue building complexity, continue moving that scene from the left-hand side of the scale to the right. Whenever we go in and disturb this landscape again, we knock succession backwards to the left. And the degree to which, or the extent to which we knock it back towards the left is dependent on our level of intervention. So for example, when we go in with a herd of animals bunched together, the trampling effect stops, for a short period of time, stops what we're doing. And if we leave them there long enough, it'll actually begin to create bare ground itself through poaching, through overgrazing, if we're not careful and we're not moving it on. Similarly, if we go in with a herbicide and apply it, we're knocking the system back to pretty much zero. Or if we go in there with a plow, of course, or the tool of fire, we're doing the same thing. So bearing in mind that nature builds resilience through complexity, we can also draw another analogy here, that the systems on the left-hand side of the scale are less resilient than the systems on the right-hand side of the scale. And what I mean is, if we think about resilience as the ability to absorb external shocks, what I'm specifically talking about here in the age of climate change is extreme weather events, extreme drought events, and the like. So agroforestry is an attempt to establish productive, and I use that word in inverted commas, tree systems within bacterially dominant systems. So typically, there are two general forms there's one general form that I'll be speaking about here today, which is called silvopasture, which is integration of trees with animal systems, with grazing systems. The other form that is applicable to Ireland is silvo-arable, and I have an example of that later on in the presentation here. But it's essentially the case where you would look to grow annual or biennial crops within rows of trees, essentially. The four ecosystem processes. This work also comes off the back of holistic management, and I find this very useful when considering design, when taking design decisions for either my farm here or for some of the farmers that I work with. It's useful to begin you're kind of, if you consider these like four different sets of glasses, that when you're looking at a particular landscape, you would assume the role of the water cycle initially, move on to the mineral cycle, energy flow, and then community dynamics. And it just helps us zone in on different parts of the system and then stitch that picture or stitch that new understanding back together so that we can attempt or make an initial attempt to balance the ecological, social, and financial soundness of these decisions within the broader context of the health of our landscapes. When we talk about water cycles, trees can be used to rebalance water cycles, and indeed, a lot of the issues that we're facing here on the Atlantic margin, and particularly here in Donegal, with high rainfall events, are because our landscapes are artificially denuded of trees from what they would have been in a more natural state. When we consider that Glenveigh National Park, a park in Glenveigh, the Glen of the Birch Trees exists, you have to walk for a pretty long way before you find a decent stand of birch trees out there. Similarly, the mountain range within which Glenveigh sits, the Derryveigh mountain range, Derryveigh, the mountains of oak and birch. These point to a past that would have been significantly would have had a significantly more canopy cover, and we have to ask ourselves the question, what's happened here? When we go out into the hills, for if any of you guys do, and you walk around certain areas, you will see, you will come across big tree stumps that were there, that existed at some point in the past, sticking up from mounds of heather. And where there is heather now, where there are ineffective water cycles, there once stood a great forest that stretched from the Bay of Biscay all the way up into Scandinavia, and that's completely gone. And that's really disappeared over the last kind of 350 years or so. And the conventional or the misguided understanding is that trees were cut down and taken away. But actually, the real mechanisms are far more poignant than that. You have you had not just ecological impacts, but you had social and financial impacts that or mechanisms that played a part of that degeneration as well. So we ended up in a situation where this, part of the closed canopy would have been logged, would have been taken away for use in building materials, would have been sold. There was a roaring charcoal trade in the 15th and 16th, or in the 16th and 17th century in the west coast of Ireland, exploiting charcoal for steel making in Great Britain. So that certainly played a part of it. The other thing that really played a huge part of it as well was the increase in grazing in these systems, and untended grazing as well. So the last wolf, for example, was shot in Ireland in 1761, I think it was, in the region of Carlow. And before that, we would have had a very, very healthy wolf population, which kept herbivore populations in check and kept those animals bunched and moving. In the absence of predators, animals behave very, very differently. And in the absence of shepherds and pastoral management on a broad landscape level with the Enclosures Act, we ended up in a situation where our woodlands were subjected to a lot of overgrazing. So the new seedlings that were coming up to be the next and future generations of these functioning ecosystems will graze to the point at which they died out. After a period of time, the demographics of that woodland completely shifted, so that you had very, very little to no juvenile woodlands coming up to replace the older veteran trees. And as the older veteran trees do reach the end of their life cycle, for an oak, it's anywhere between 400 and 1200 years. For an older tree, anywhere between 30 and 60 years. There's nothing to replace them. So either through deforestation caused by man, or overgrazing, preventing regeneration of these woodlands, a system simply disappears. Over a number of generations, the tree cover falls and falls. And the entomology, the root of the names of our areas around us, really point to this history, and it bears no resemblance to what we see outside of our windows today. When it comes to the farm context, though, some really cool research has been done in Wales, which has a very, very similar social and ecological history as we have here in the west of Ireland, meaning like deforestation and overgrazing. When it comes to water management and managing the water cycle, water has been shown or observed to infiltrate into the soil column up to 67 times faster beneath trees and hedgerows than it does under grass. So what that means is that in peak flood events, like we had in Inishowen back in, 2012, we had, when we had like 6 weeks of rainfall in 30 hours, at the very end of our summer. These big peak events are actually attenuated. We don't get that mass flash flood effect that rips out bridges and roads, and instead water is caught, slowed down, the energy is taken out of it, and it's actually infiltrated into the soil structure higher up in the landscape, and that kind of deadens the effect downstream. Tree species which thrive in damp conditions can actually be used to dry up those areas that would otherwise be too wet to use, or even for season extension. So what I'm speaking about here are, in particular, in my context here in Glendon, is species like willow and alder, which, we've got some great anecdotal evidence right here on the farm in areas where natural regeneration has been allowed to take hold, has been allowed to kick on with the exclusion of grazing pressure, that we've got some incredible quality grass coming up, and just 10, 15 feet away, we're back into heather, we're back into really poor quality acid grassland. And it's because the water cycle locally has been restored by those examples of natural regeneration. The other thing about water cycle is trees have approximately 50% of their biomass above ground, and about 50% below ground as well. And through the photosynthetic process, trees are constantly pulling, through photosynthesis in their leaves, they're creating carbohydrates and sugars, pumping that down into the soil structure, feeding the soil food web, With alder, for example, it's a pitching tree. It's leguminous, kind of like gorse. So there are colonies of bacteria that exist in nodules on the roots, and they benefit from the tree by taking some of the carbohydrates and sugars. That the tree will essentially exist in symbiosis with these colonies of bacteria. And what the bacteria will do, it'll take insoluble nitrogen from the atmosphere and essentially fix it and make it soluble, make it available at the biological level within the root zone, within the discrete root zone of the root of the tree. And what I mean by that is between 0.1 and 1 millimeter from the main branch roots. And so we have, again, another example of nature completing the cycle, taking nitrogen from the atmosphere that the tree can't directly access. The tree supports this colony of bacteria that can be the middleman, that can perform that function for it. And the tree also chooses to support those colonies by depositing the correct hormonal signals within the soil, and also the sugars and carbohydrates that it needs. The effect of that is that we end up sequestering carbon in our soil, not just in the bodies of all of these microorganisms, but also in the form of non-labile carbon or humic compounds. Now, humic compounds are something that's going to become more and more important, particularly in your career as farmers and agriculturalists, because our ability for farms to become carbon negative, to actually become carbon sinks, is well within our grasp, if only we watch how nature does it. This table here in front of us is the work of Glenn David Morris. It was an MSc thesis from 2004, and he did this great catchment analysis in a dryland setting in I think it was New South Wales, where he basically increased the humus content of soil, and he was able to extrapolate these observations up to what it would mean if we were to increase humus content by 1% incrementally to 5%, which is considered pre-settlement levels, pre-human levels, European arrival levels, across a 30-centimeter column across a hectare. And you can see with each 0.5% increase, we're looking at an additional water holding capacity of about 80,000 litres. So when we scale up a 5% increase across a 30-centimeter deep soil column over a hectare, we're talking about the ability for us to store an additional 800,000 litres of water within that soil structure. And I'm not talking about free water. I'm not talking about the pore space of a soil structure being completely inundated and devoid of oxygen. What I'm talking about is water molecules being held at the atomic level within the soil structure. What this means is that those soil systems with increased levels of humus, with increased levels of carbon, increased stores of carbon, are able to weather drought events far more resiliently than soils that have less humus. When we consider that every time we interact with the soil, be it by mechanical means or chemical means, we're actually pushing the system towards the left in that previous image. We're actually decreasing the amount of carbon held within our soils. We're actually making our systems less and less resilient year on year, and we're setting ourselves up for failure. When we consider the mineral cycle, as I've already said, trees have about 50% of their biomass above ground, 50% below ground. Tree roots can reach deep, much deeper into the earth, deeper than grasses in many cases, and thus they're able to access mineral stores that aren't available in the surface of the soil. Nature is constantly working to balance out gradients. Where there is a deficiency, nature is constantly working to normalize that deficiency. And in the case of trees, it does this in deciduous systems by tree roots go down, pull up minerals from deep in the earth. They form all of this biomass above ground, which becomes leaf surface, essentially, photosynthesis mechanisms during the growing season. And then at the end of the growing season, it pulls the sugars back. The leaves turn from green to brown. and then all of this biomass, all this carbon-rich and nutrient-rich material gets dumped at the soil surface. That is a tree essentially self-fertilizing itself and rebalancing mineral profiles. It's quite a wonderful mechanism when you consider it, and all we've got to do is mimic nature. In the presence of the correct soil biology, this material breaks down in no time at all, and we end up with really, really resilient food webs, growing better quality grass with restored water cycles right within our pasture. One of the other things to consider here is that when we have these minerals that are perhaps missing or in low supply in our grassland systems, but very often these species can be very rich in them. For example, Salix viminalis, which is an osier willow, has really high levels of zinc, manganese, and boron. All of these are critical for plant health, but all of these are also critical for animal health. So, you know, even 400, 500, 600 years ago, tree fodder or tree hay was a well-known practice. And indeed, I've just come back from a few months working with some farmers in Sweden, and the practice, it's still practiced there today, where they take riparian areas. So these are areas along lake shores and river areas, and they will harvest right at the height of summer. They will harvest branches of these pioneer species, of these pioneer trees, and store them dried and feed them to cattle and sheep over the winter to rebalance some of their nutrient profile. And the nutrient analysis has been done, and it's at least as good, if not better, than a lot of the best grassland hay that are in these regions. So, you know, there's a lot of wisdom in old practices if we consider actually what's going on there from the perspective of nature and natural systems. Energy flow. I really like this part of this part of the discussion, because it begins to get us out of the paradigm of thinking of our farms as two-dimensional areas. Very often, you know, we look at our plant on our subsidy maps, or we look at our farm on our subsidy maps. We consider them maybe on Google Earth if we're a little bit more savvy. But we do fall into that trap again and again of thinking about them in terms of two-dimensional structures. But when we begin to approach these landscapes with an agroforestry mindset, we apply a third dimension to it. We're looking at what can we harvest below ground with these deep-reaching roots, but also what biomass can we put above ground. So that third dimension, that additional height, allows us to put much more photosynthesizing surfaces pointing towards the sun. We're capturing more sunlight, therefore we're pulling down more carbon, we're creating more carbohydrates and sugars to feed our soil food web, we're creating much more biomass, both in the forms of what we're feeding to our animals, but also in what we're feeding the soil food web. An additional benefit, again, when thinking about that third dimension of height, is that we can begin to think about how we might create microclimates on our farms. An example would be establishing shelter belts on some particular areas of the farm that are more exposed than others. I know here on the farm, that's been my focus for the last 4 years or so. There were areas of the farm that were just far too exposed to the westerlies for 9 months of the year, that I couldn't graze them at all in you know, adverse weather. You know, just too hard on livestock. And then you know, other parts of the farm in the winter, I made that mistake in my first year here, trying to keep back grass for winter grazing in a particular paddock that was just wide open to the north. And when the prevailing weather winds switch round to that continental blow coming from the north in the winter, again, it would cut the nose of you. You know, you couldn't put livestock out on that. So creating shelter, creating microclimates, that lowers the wind speed, resulting in a higher ambient temperature, reducing evapotranspiration. So it means that we're, in times of drought, we're not getting as much evaporation as we would. But it's also easier on animals. You know, we're by reducing the wind speed, we're reducing animal stress, which means that they're spending less, you know, in very simplistic terms, spending less energy shivering and more energy growing. Community dynamics, as we've said before, nature builds resilience through complexity. And so anytime we can seek to add in another layer of complexity, of natural complexity, not management complexity, but natural complexity into our farming systems, we should really seek to figure out if it's right for us. As I already mentioned, trees provide a vast support of or many functions to support biodiversity and the health of water cycles, mineral cycles. We should be looking to build resilience in our future, in our systems, in our farming systems, just in the same way that nature does. So in terms of agroforestry in the Irish context, it's kind of a new-ish kind of thing. And I say that with kind of bated breath, because agroforestry, or the concept of, if you consider way back when humans moved from a hunter-gatherer role where they were roaming in packs through a landscape to a role where they could actually harness the power of annual seeds and begin setting some crops, they would have been in a much more wooded environment. So the very first attempts at agroforestry would have been to clear woodland while still maintaining areas of mature and healthy functioning woodland ecosystems around the fringe. So you can imagine settlements springing up essentially in like woodland glades. These glades would have been very well protected, and they would have had a lot of wildlife passing through. So not just for the agrarian benefits, but also for the opportunities that hunting that would have been, those early agrarian settlers would have had increased opportunities from hunting by creating these open glades as well. But in terms of the modern context, we have one mature operation on the island of Ireland, which is in Loughgall. And this is 30 years old this year. Now, the project was started as a joint project between the Department of Ag up in the north and the Queen's University Belfast. And Jim McAdam kind of led it for, I think, the last 12 years or so, and he's recently retired. And he was kind enough to share some of these images with me. So this picture here is actually from the Loughgall site, and he uses it as a bit of a teaching tool to point out some of the fringe benefits of an agroforestry system. You can see everything from increased carbon storage and sequestration, healthy soils, water purification, as well as the conventional kind of yields of wool, meat. We have an increased support for biodiversity and pollinators. We have potential for tree fodder, as we've spoken about, flood control in the form of water in the form of peak flow attenuation, renewable energy. Despite what people say, when you manage trees in a consistent way, when you manage tree systems in a consistent way, because of the life cycle of how long it takes to grow wood actually is a renewable source. And the amenity value is something. It is another thing that's often overlooked as well. As humans, there is something very deep and primal and restful, actually, with being in functioning woodland systems. I'm not talking about going for a walk down your local quilcha patch, but if you do find yourself out in Garden, for example, there's about 60 acres here on the south shore of the lake, which is pretty much untouched for the last 200 years or so. And the place is just humming with life, and it's really restful to walk within. So there's a certain degree of an amenity value as well to these systems. When we compare that to what a conventional grazing setup on an adjacent plot of land, again here in Loughgall, is, we lose many of those benefits. And we can, if we knew nothing about the context of this presentation this morning, I guess most of you would agree that the first picture is likely to be more of a resilient and pleasant system to manage than the second. Unfortunately, the second is all too common. So this is the Loughgall site at various stages of development. The left-hand picture here is at year 3. They used some biodegradable tree guards here. At year 6, so the livestock was excluded for the first 3 or 4 years or so. And then as the trees got up and got away, they were able to reintroduce the livestock again. By year 8, you can see they're pretty much back up to full utilization. Year 16 was the first thinning, and then 3 years later, at year 19, was the second year thinning. This picture here in the bottom right was it was taken at year 19, and now that looks like quite a closed canopy, but they actually only have about and you know, a lot of farmers would be fearful of this, suggesting that your grass production underneath, you know, would drop off significantly. Actually, they had somewhere in the region of 70-75% grass production under this level of canopy as they did under an open field. So you're actually gaining a lot more fringe benefits. You know, all the ones that we've pointed out for just a slight drop in overall production. This is what the site looks like at year 26 beneath that canopy. So again, it looks worse from the outside than it does on the inside. You've got about 70, somewhere north of 70% canopy closure there, and you're still up at around 70-75% grass production. This is the longest agroforestry trial in Europe, by the way. Now, there are a couple of benefits that maybe don't initially jump out at you on this. One is that the thinnings that were liberated early on in the life cycle of this particular project were also revenue generating. So the trees in this scenario are ash, and because they've been maintained and looked after, they're really, really high quality. So they were able to obtain 2 essentially cash crops, if you like, during this life cycle. In addition to that, the studies, because this is in relation to Queen's University, they had lots of MSc and PhD students on hand to carry out studies, and they figured out that they were sequestering, just by virtue of the biomass in the trees alone, 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year, and that's at you know, close to the 26-year maturity mark here. This is with 220 trees per hectare. In addition to that, the grass component underneath the trees is also, of course, sequestering carbon at a rate of about 0.8 ton carbon per hectare per year. So that total of 3.2 tons carbon per hectare per year is actually going to become an increasingly important number for you guys as farmers and as agriculturalists in the years to come, because the idea of carbon credits and farmers and landscape managers being paid for carbon credits is right around the corner. In fact, 2 years ago, the first farmer was paid under an agri-environmental scheme for carbon sequestration in Australia. The current rate of payment of carbon credits in Europe is somewhere in the region of 120 to 150 euros per tonne. So we can add that economic benefit on top of all of the ecosystem benefits, and on top of the system services, and on top of the animal benefits, livestock benefits, with just a marginal, 20-25% drop off in grass production. In addition to all of that, this is what I consider to be a really exciting observation from the Loughgall project as well. So the blue line, the upper blue line of the graph here is moisture content in soils in an adjacent patch just under grass. And the grey line, which sits on below, is moisture content in soils in the agroforestry plot. If we were to consider 40% moisture content as an arbitrary cutoff value, as when we would take stock off, we can see that there's a huge benefit here, essentially a season extension from our agroforestry plot to our adjacent grassland plot, that we can keep animals out. And this is the concept that Paddy spoke about earlier on, about in the idea of having a green shed. So it's not just about the wind speed Of course, that's a big part of it. It's not just about driving rain in the winter. Again, of course, that's a big part of it. But it's the ability of the ground to actually hold up livestock during those adverse weather events. The longer we can keep cattle out, cattle or livestock out, the less time we have to feed them, and the less emissions we, as an overall farming project, will have. And in this example, we're talking about 17 weeks of season extension, which is not to be sniffed at. So when it comes to your own farms, where do we begin? So a lot of the work I've been doing over the past couple of years has been refining some of these design skills here on the farm in Donegal, and then also working with farmers around the UK, Ireland, and broader Europe to begin getting to think longer term about what the structure of their own farms might look like, and indeed might need to look like in the face of a changing climate. And one of the kind of core methodologies that I've come across is this concept of developing a pattern language for your landscape, where essentially you're not you're trying to avoid the place where we're suffering consistently from decision fatigue. And what this looks like is based on the work of a guy called Alfred Yeomans from the 1940s and 50s in Australia. And he developed this concept of a keyline scale of permanence. And this is an approach to designing agroforestry systems where we work from patterns to details. So we would work at the top right at the climate level first. We would begin to understand the broader patterns of our climate within which the bioregion that the farm sits, and then work down through land shape. What does our land look like? How does water move over the site currently? Where do we currently access sites? How is that working for us? Where are our farm tracks and farm roads? Where do they need to be? Then right in the middle of the pack there, we look at selecting appropriate species of trees, so the right trees in the right locations to meet our needs. And then we look at placing more permanent structures within the landscape, sheds and the like. Then we consider how we bunch our animals together and keep them moving across the landscape in a mob grazing or holistic planned grazing fashion. So that feeds into where we place our fences, subdivisions, water points, electric fence charge points. And then ultimately soil. What is our soil condition? And you know, how can we impact that? Which way does it need to go? So for the farm here in Churchill, these are some of the objectives that I set out. So primarily we're talking about an animal-based agriculture system. I'm really interested in, you know, answering or exploring the question, how much carbon can I pull down out of the atmosphere, and how diverse can I make these landscapes? I grew up looking at these bare hills, and up until 5 years ago, I was I would suggest, like most of the population in the west of Ireland, I was sold on the idea that these bare hills were actually the natural state, were actually peak ecosystem. But they're not. They're an artificially denuded landscape, and they're actually symptomatic of an ecosystem that's on its knees. So I'm really excited to see what the future can hold for building diversity within this landscape. I want to develop a system that isn't relying on one stream of production. So we're not just sheep, we're not just cattle, for example, that we're looking to diversify streams of production across, not just across livestock systems, but also across other forms of production, annual or perennial crops. Looking to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, increase biodiversity in the local region, and protect water quality. So when you can only really have a good go at design for your own places when you really get honest and clear with yourself about what the objectives are. That's the first stage in any kind of design process. Some of the questions you might ask yourself, again, working from patterns to details, are, you know, what are the prevailing weather patterns at my site? So for example, most of the glens, well, all of the major glens here between northern Scotland and ourselves here on the Atlantic fringe run generally northeast, southwest. And most of our wind comes from the west or southwest, which means that we've got the ideal scenario for funneling wind. Whenever you put a wind through a constriction, the relative wind speed speeds up and the conditions actually get worse. So the ability for us to recognize that pattern within the landscape directly informs where we would place shelter belts, for example. The other major climatic pattern in this part of the world is that in the winter, the prevailing wind does swing round to the north and we get these cold snaps. So considering where we might want to set aside ground for winter grazing is a really key part of our management process and decision process. We can, of course, create shelter belts which give us greater flexibility in the future, but we need to make that decision like 5 years ago or now so that we can graze there in 5 or 6 years' time. Landform aspect and access. My farm is across 5 different sites in this valley. Some sites are high and very exposed, some sites are low and sheltered, some sites face north, some sites face south. And we have two broad soil categories. One is an alluvial type soil, glacial, which tends to be on the northern sites or on the northern side of the valleys. And then we have a lower, boggier, high in organic matter, typified by ineffective water cycle on the southern and lower fringes. So all of these observations feed into our design when it comes to like not just tree placement, but what species of trees go where, and ultimately where we want the system to go. Do we want it to go to the right on that pattern and increasing complexity, or to the left? What are the climax skills in our biome? This is a good point, because again, we're looking at nature at every opportunity to be our guide and our teacher. So in my particular context around here, and indeed everywhere between Malin and Mizzen, essentially, the climax guild in protected mineral soil sites is an oak, hazel, holly understory. Oak, ash, hazel, holly. Those are the kind of climax skills. So now that we know that, that's kind of what we can work towards. If we work towards that, it's going to be the lowest entropy approach to building complexity in our system, because that's how nature does it. We're not trying to shoehorn nature into doing something else. If we do, we're only going to be fighting a losing battle. And the final point there about stacking functions. So we're not, when we design a tree system or consider where we're placing tree systems in our sites, we're not just designing, for example, for water infiltration or shelter creation, but we're also designing for additional yields. So like the Loughgall experiment was 100% ash plantation at fixed centres. We can get creative about it. We can plant across contour. We can plant along roadways to delineate roadways. We can plant early succession species that are really vigorous and really tough to get these systems rocking and rolling, and then look at planting in more productive, desirable species later on, once these new systems have a certain degree of stability and are well established. So we can begin to, longer term, we can begin to think about what fruits, nuts, timber, fodder, tree hay might I want from these different sites, and at what time of the year. So again, we're looking to obtain multiple yields off the same land use. We're looking to, the term I've used here is to stack functions. So there's no one element of the system that only does one thing. That's how we build resiliency. When it comes to defining land units, on the farm here, we've got, as I said before, we've got 3 kind of broad classifications. We've got these greener areas here are kind of improved or better quality pasture ground. In between here, you can see we've got areas of natural woodland regeneration. So this area here is just full of oak and hazel all along here. And then we've got areas which are kind of characterized by an ineffective water cycle. These areas are kind of boggier, more of an acid graphite kind of setup. But bear in mind, as with the earlier description about succession, acid grassland, we need to get away from the idea that, oh, that's what I have and that's what it'll always be. We have this great ability, once we've observed where a particular square foot or square meter or hectare is on that successional cycle, we have a decision to make. We can decide whether we push it forward in succession, we help it along, or whether we knock it back, and how we might knock it back. So an example up here might be just bunching heavier animals and moving them around to get to knock the system back towards an earlier grassland phase, knock back some of this heather, and get it back into a more functioning grassland phase. Or indeed, where the site gets really steep, where these contours get closer together, we might want to actually nudge that tree line back up the slope and create more sheltered areas where the ground is flatter. Again, it's all about just adding structure, using that third dimension that third dimension approach in our landscape design, and begin thinking about what does the landscape need to look like 30, 50, 100, 300 years from now. I've got a lot of rivers and waterways that run through the site here, and I've just made a blanket decision. Like, most of them are practically bare. You know, this idea that fence lines were pushed right up to waterline in the past, and I've just made a blanket decision purely for, well, not purely, but largely for aesthetic reasons, largely for environmental reasons. Just to re-establish riparian corridors. So riparian buffers is the term given to whenever you have trees delineating waterways through a landscape. And it kind of makes the decision easy. It's like, okay, there's a river, boom. What we're doing is we're stepping fences back 8 or 10 meters on each side. And we can either choose then just to let nature do its thing, or we can choose to go in there and augment nature, try and speed up that successional process through planting, for example. And the idea is really to use, in my context on the farm here, I'm really trying to take isolated pockets of existing native woodland and join them up using these riparian zones to create systems of glades that will be grazed in years to come. Here's an example in the picture of a silvo-arable setup. So we have an annual crop in here beneath sheltered by hazel production. This is from a farm in Oxfordshire. Sorry, this farm here is Lincolnshire in England. There's a good friend of mine who has a farm in Oxfordshire who is on these high sandy plains where the wind just absolutely kills it. He's an arable farmer, and he decided to set up north-south windbreaks every 12 to 20 meters or so, and he was farming crops, so that he was still able to get up. He designed the alleyway width, so he was still able to get up with his big machinery. And the objective was just to create microclimates, really, just to slow that wind speed down, so that he could to see if he could potentially get a bit of season extension going on. And it completely worked. His yield, within 5 years, the yield of the operation had gone up 30% with no additional inputs. He was seeing an increase in organic matter in the soil. He was seeing increased drought resistance, less demand for less pest pressure as well, actually, in his crops. So we're getting into the final couple of slides here. Just to give you a bit of context on the farm, where that green blob in the middle of Donegal there is Glenveigh, and we share a border to the south. This is the fence line of Glenveigh National Park. This is Garden Lake. These are the 5 main sites of the farm, ranging in size from 45 acres or so down to about 8. This site in particular, this is the one I was talking about before, where we had really, really lovely mineral soils here. You can see this pocket of mature woodland running right down to the shore, and a bit of a wetland habitat poking out into the into the lake. This woodland in here is characterized by really mature oak ash with an understory of hazel running up the middle band. And then we have some earlier pioneer birch coming up and circling around just here in the middle of the site. You can see this line that runs down towards the lake is actually a small spring, or the outflow from a small spring, which sits up here. And this is the site, because it's one of the sites, it's south facing. And of course, our prevailing winds come in from this way. And in good weather, it's brilliant. It's fantastic. But even like you've got, when I started moving animals around this place, of course, I'm bunching them and moving them, which means that I'm trying to get a better utilization of grass in these more exposed areas. Whenever we did have cold snaps or high wind events or anything like that, the animals were suffering, and I would have to abandon the mob grazing. So the broader plan for this is essentially to re-establish a big shelter belt down this western side, which would sit in there. And then don't forget, again, we have a site that these are 10-meter contours, so the site falls away here down to the lake. But we do have a big wind that comes in the winter from the north. So I'm essentially looking to establish a shelter belt here, and then another one along this contour, which runs out to the edge of the site. I've already said to you earlier on in the discussion that along this, anywhere where there's water, I'm looking to re-establish riparian zones just to protect water quality. So that immediately removes a decision fatigue for me. And I say, right, okay, I'm going to bounder off this area as well to protect water quality. And then I end up in a scenario where in the longer term, the vision for this place essentially is to have 3 main grazing cells, where we have one in here above the road, one in a newly created glade, which sits here, and one in an area that's currently infested with bracken. So in the middle of July, this 3rd cell, when I go into it, the bracken is 6 foot tall. Remember I said to you before that when we recognize where on that successional cycle a particular plot of land is, we have the decision at that point whether to help it forward in succession or whether to knock it back. This is an example on the farm here where I'll be looking to knock it back. So the bracken appears on mineral-rich soils and is an indicator species for an emergent woodland. So the do nothing scenario, if I was to remove all grazing pressure from this, is that within the next, I would guess, 10 years or so, this entire site here would be covered in woodland, young pioneer woodland, likely be encroached by the birches and goes from along the stream. And on a long enough timeline, you would see hazel and oak and ash moving into this opening as well. And then we would begin to see this area of ground becoming claimed by some of those early pioneer woodlands. But I've taken the decision here by establishing my tree systems, or by kind of committing to those tree systems, that I want to knock this patch back into an early aesthetic succession. So the way I do that, I could go in and plow it. I could go in and spray a herbicide, both very, very effective, but both money and carbon intensive, and really, really destructive from a soil structure point of view. So the other option I have is, remember the other tool that I have is livestock. So I can go in here and I could select systems essentially like a mob grazed pig operation to go in and to turn over the soil and to expose the rhizome of the bracken towards the end of the year, so that those frosts get to the rhizome and break it up. And what we would see is after an impact like that, particularly at the right time of year, just before the season closes, we would see that in the following season we wouldn't get the rebound of the bracken that we typically would, and we'd see more grass. And that observation is borne out by the fact that up here a number of years ago we had an incident where we made a bit of a mess at the wrong time of year with a tractor and ended up breaking the ground around about October time. And in the mess of getting the tractor out, one of the surprises actually of that incident was that the ground in this area was essentially bracken free for the next 5 or 8 years. So, you know, again, by letting animals do the work, letting pigs be pigs, and just focusing their behavior, becoming the predator, keeping them bunched and moving, using electric netting or electric fences, we can use them to really sculpt a landscape in the manner that we want. So for anybody that wants to maybe do a bit of background reading, I'm not going to give you a huge reading list, but here are two that really stuck out for me on my journey. The first is this guy, Mark Shepherd, a really no-nonsense scientist by trade, began realizing the limitations of the reductionist mindset, the reductionist approach to agriculture, and started this farm in Wisconsin in the USA in 1994. He published this book in 2013 called Restoration Agriculture, and he likes to pride himself on his approach, which he calls STUN, an acronym for sheer, total, utter neglect. So basically what he looks to do is to mimic the local biome structures, identify what are the climax species and what are the subspecies, and then substitute them for species of tree and shrub that have more marketable yields in his context. And he's developed this system, which is an integrated multi-level agriculture system, as opposed to all of his neighbors, which are basically fields of soy as far as the horizon. The really interesting thing about this book is in the final couple of chapters, he does this like-for-like comparison of calorific yields between his approach to agriculture on the 106 acres and what his friends are doing or what his immediate neighbors are doing. And the results are staggering. Mark's big thing is about, can we design farms that are essentially whole menu farms that can meet all of our human needs whilst also supporting nature's needs. And his farm looks kind of funky. It looks like this. So what Mark has done here is he's taken those core concepts of agroforestry that I've spoken about, and he's got a bit playful with them, really. So essentially all of this is planted on what we call a modified keyline design, which is essentially slightly off contour. And the idea is that in Wisconsin, I think they get about 500 mil of rain a year, and they tend to get it in a couple of big plumps. So having water available on the brittleness scale, they're probably up at around a 6 or 5 or something. They're farther to the right, farther to the more brittle end than we are. And having water available during the year really means that plants can get after it and get growing. So by planting on contour or slightly off contour, he's controlling, he's preventing water from running directly at 90 degrees to contour and just sheeting off this landscape. And the phrase that's often bandied around is, where water wants to run, let it walk, or make it walk. And so every time he puts a line across contour here, he's forcing water to slow down and to infiltrate, giving it an opportunity to infiltrate beneath tree systems. When Mark initially developed this farm, of course, he had long-term aspirations of what the main crops would be, but they were going to take a number of years to mature. So he focused on developing elements of the system in conjunction with a silvo-arable setup, whereby he was planting commercial annual cash crops in the tree rows, whilst the perennial crops in the tree systems were maturing. And as the farm matures, as the farm's gone on from 1994, the ratio of where his income is coming from shifted from primarily from annual crops to primarily from perennial crops as the system matures. And he's building resilience at every turn. When he speaks about his approach, sheer, total, utter neglect, what he means basically is throwing as much genetic diversity at the site as possible. So he's not just planting one species of apple tree or one species of nut. He's planting 50 or 300. He's labeling them, and then he's keeping a real close eye on traits that he wants to encourage on his site. So, for example, if there's a variety that flowers late, that might be more susceptible to frosts, early frosts, it's gone. He just doesn't care about it at all. He won't save seed from that, and indeed, he'll probably chop it and drop it. Varieties that exhibit characteristics that he will proliferate from those. So, for example, he will take scion wood from apple and pear trees that exhibit the right type of behavior or produce particularly well for his climate, and similarly propagate on from nut species that seem to suit his zone. So he's constantly looking what he would do in a natural succession on a long timeline. Mark's just looking to reduce the latency in that succession selection. He's just looking to speed up the iteration on his site. Looks kind of cool, eh? The second one was this guy, J. Russell Smith. This is an older text now. This was first published in 1929. One of J. Russell Smith's first early observations that became the foundation of this work was that this romantic idea that we have of pilgrims arriving on the east coast of the United States or continental North America with this desire to go west is a bit of a misnomer, and it wasn't born of a thirst for adventure, but rather ecosystem collapse. So he posits this pattern or broader social pattern of virgin forest being transitioned into field, being ploughed subsequent years, and then eventually the ecosystem falls over and we end up with desert. So J. Russell Smith observed this pattern and strung it out into this book, and he drew comparisons and examples from cultures all around the world, including some ancient cultures in the breadbasket of humanity, or the cradle of humanity, in the Middle East. And he published this work, and it kind of went unrecognized for maybe 30 or 40 years. The irony of this is that it was published in 1929, and the real bad years of the Dust Bowl in America happened just 5 years later. There were two main observations to this work. One is that diesel power and the advent of tractors allowed us to push flatland agriculture into more and more unsuitable sites. We now had the ability to plough marginal slopes, for example. And there was also this shift from perennial fruits and nuts to grain inputs. And we began, in the US, around the 1930s and 40s, there was a big push to begin supporting some of these local grain markets in order to support local communities. The knock-on unintended consequence of that is that we became more and more reliant on them, and our resilient perennial production systems kind of fell by the wayside. This book's available online, it's free, it's a really nice read. And I'd just like to quote this part of it for you guys. It says, across the valley, I saw a mountainside clothed in chestnut trees. The trees reached up the mountain to the place where the coolness stopped their growth. They extended down the mountain to the place where it was too dry for trees. This chestnut orchard, or forest as one may call it, spread along the mountainside as far as the eye could see. The expanse of broad-topped, fruitful trees was interspersed with a string of villages and stone houses. The villages were connected by a good road that ran horizontally in and out along the projections and coves of the mountainside. These grafted chestnut orchards produce an annual crop of food for men, horses, cows, pigs, sheep, and goats, and a bycrop of wood. Thus, for centuries, trees had supported families that lived in the Corsican villages. The mountainside was uneroded, intact, and capable of continuing indefinitely its support for the generations of men. And I ask you guys to reflect, is that the same vision that we are holding in our minds as farmers? How viable will the farms that you all have at home be at the end of your time on this earth, at the end of your children's time? If we don't keep this kind of observation in mind, we are on a path to degeneration. Our soils and our ecosystems will collapse quite literally beneath our feet. Like in the Dust Bowl, they will gather up in the next big storm event, be it wind or rain, and wash down mountainsides and pollute rivers, and we'll lose our abilities to support the local communities and grow food where we live, unless we change our paradigm. And that's the fourth dimension of landscape management or landscape design, is time. So we've spoken about the 2D aspect of mapping our farm, the third dimension of height, and the fourth dimension of time. It's get clear on the future that you want. Get clear on the future that you want for your communities, for your landscapes, for your own children if you have them, and string out that vision for your farm, and I guarantee you'll behave differently. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, John. A lot of things covered there. Some of the stuff we would have touched on in class before, but not to the same detail or the same caliber now, in fairness. Has anyone in the class there any questions? in relation to that. We see there last week there was chat on in the media of farmers in the west of Ireland being asked, or a scheme being made available to re-wet boglands and to plant considerable tracts of woodland. That would tie in here with, now that's from a carbon sink point of view, the re-wetting of the boglands, but the planting of woodlands is mainly from a carbon sink point of view as well. You seem talking about Loughgall in relation to how much carbon, how much is it per hectare again? 2.4 tonne per year?
Yeah, so the tree biomass was 2.4 tonne per hectare per year. And then, of course, on top of that, you had the additional 0.8 tonne of the carbon sequestration of the grass.
Of the grass as well. So yeah, collectively it was what,
3.2.
over 3.5 tonne nearly?
Yeah.
3.2, yeah.
And
So,
and
you say that is the currency will be.
The other point to consider there is that, like current, I think the average figure for pasture beef in Ireland is about 4 tonne of emissions per hectare per year. So when we look at agroforestry, well-designed agroforestry systems, we can already close that gap quite significantly. If we're saying a conventional system emits around about 4 tonne per hectare per year, but we can sequester with a mature agroforestry system about 3.2, we then only have a much smaller challenge ahead of us.
Yes. So we could be not too far off carbon neutral if we incorporated more agroforestry into it. Now, in relation to your own farm there and having witnessed your presentations in the past, what is the plan in relation to the trees? Like, where are you going to get the income? Like, I remember you talking about the nuts and the shelter belts, and that the initial trees that you plant in relation to a shelter belt could possibly use then for firewood. They're like, you could put in something like lodgepole pine or something in first on the windy side, and in the inner row would the more softer trees, but the more high value trees that take longer to establish, will get a bit of shelter from the likes of the fast growing lodgepole pine or something like that. But then at a later stage you would remove the lodgepole pine because it wouldn't have the same benefit in terms of ecology or biodiversity.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things in that observation there. I guess the main thing you're pointing towards is that fourth dimension of design. So planting very vigorous species, even non-natives. I plant a lot of Italian alder, which grow about 3 times as fast as a native alder, and a lot of biomass willow on the weather side, on the windward side of these shelter belts, just to get them up and get away. And then inside those, that initial protection, I seek to plant a lot more native species that are going to be, just more pleasing, or maybe they have a different, a more pointed purpose and broader farm production system. And then at some point, I'm looking to go in and harvest that biomass once the natives or the more desirable species are up and established. And for me, the harvesting that biomass is a great win, because I can heat water, I can heat a house, I can make charcoal, which helps me improve soil structure. I can create wood chip, which helps me feed the fungal element of my soil food web. I'm just looking to close loops at all opportunities. There are some great examples around Europe of farms generating substantial income from mushroom cultivation on logwood that comes out of these shelter belts. That's another avenue that could be explored. But the important thing to keep in mind here is that when we talk about establishing shelter belts, like let's take, for example, that site that I had back here. When we talk about establishing shelter belts along these edges, we're not talking about fencing them off in perpetuity. We're talking about fencing them off for a maximum of about 5 years, just until the trees get up and get kind of thick enough and get sturdy enough that they're not going to be barked.
Yes.
And get away. And when we talk about, just excluding stock for them just for the establishment phase, then actually and then we consider that we're actually growing better quality grass beneath the trees because we've repaired the water cycles in those discrete areas, we actually end up in a scenario where we can crash graze those zones in areas, for example, in drought. So, for example, out here in the middle of that glade, it might be more prone to drought conditions, for example. But if I'm growing a shelter belt along this edge of the field, along this edge of the field here, and I'm bunching animals and moving them anyway, there's no reason why I can't bunch them and run them in through that tree system.
When it's established?
Once it's established, yeah.
Yeah. Have you any issues with see, in relation to your juvenile trees, in relation to deer predation, because you're not too far away from that is deer country?
Yeah, we've got a lot of issues here with deer, and I've got a solution in a steel cabinet next to me. That's part of the solution. So yeah, part of the farm production.
You might want to explain to the rest of them.
Oh,
you might want to explain to the rest of them what's in the steel container. I know what it is for.
Yeah, about 4 years ago, I grew up in this area, so I knew what the deer pressure was like. So, and in the absence of predator, the onus falls to us to become the wolf. So deer will behave in a certain way if they're not predated upon. But when you start shooting a few of them, their behavior changes. And it's fascinating to see, actually. I would have areas of the farm that would have been completely stripped bare. You'd hardly think there was any grass growing through the season at all. And I would take, 5 or 6 animals out of those areas in a season, and they would begin avoiding those areas. The deer realize when they're being predated upon, and they'll change their habits to avoid those high risk areas. The additional benefit, of course, is now we have an additional production stream on the farm. So, if you think about the ideal scenario for a farm, it's one that requires like 0 inputs and you get a really high value, high quality product out the other end. Well, venison is a pretty cool way of doing that, in the right markets with the right infrastructure set up. We're not too far away from beginning to market directly as you might market lamb or mutton or beef. As a lot of farmers in Ireland are beginning to do. They're beginning to not sell into the commodity market, but instead re-establish local market links. And venison may be, in the short to medium term, may actually be a big part of the economics of this farm.
Yeah. Folks, any questions from the floor there? Anyone in similar situations or considering taking in or availing of planting trees in their farm as a result of that scheme that's going to be introduced? Is there any questions you'd have here now when you have someone who is relatively experienced in the area on advice? John, traditionally, if you look at forest plantations, they go in with a digger first and they drain it, and then they hook out a sod and invert it and leave it sitting on top of the soil, and then they stick the young saplings or something into that. Where do you stand on that in terms of draining the bog is going to be releasing carbon? Is it a short-term pain for a long-term gain, or is there an alternative way to planting those trees to make it not to make it functional as well? Like, there's no much point in you deviating from that path if it's not going to achieve the same end goal. Like, if you can do it more environmentally friendly or a more carbon friendly way, deadly. But is that the best way to do it, or is there an alternative to doing it that way?
Yeah, I mean, depending upon what your objectives are, the correct solution for you, or the most fitting solution, will come forward. In the context of commercial forestry production, that approach has evolved because it's successful. But as I said earlier on, that's a reductionist approach. That's they're only looking. In arriving at that solution, they're only looking at a particular single string of outcome, one desired outcome, and they're not taking into account
one objective.
Yeah, they're not taking into account the broader negative impacts on biodiversity, on carbon emissions from drained bogs and the like. So for me, in my context on this farm, I will not plant bog. Like it's as simple as that. Now the funny thing that happens there is that let me step back a bit. I won't plant any kind of bog or marginal land at all. Full stop. The agroforestry systems, the three main systems that I'm looking to establish on this farm, are all on improved or better quality grassland that I have available to me. So primarily, I'm not running into that issue. The second thing is that when you remove grazing pressure from those bogland habitats, I have just to the west here of this site that's on the screen here, there's a small site. It's about 8 acres in size, and it runs down to the main river that runs into Garton Lake here. That site has been fenced off for, I'm going to say, 24 years. Now the only animals that have been through that site are deer, so that they can jump. And on that particular site, there are great examples of regeneration. So natural regeneration does occur on bogland. It does occur on peat, but only in the absence of grazing. So the question then becomes, like, what do we want to do here? Do we want to? Do we need to make best use of every inch of our fenced land, or can we get really, really good at managing grass production through grazing techniques and through the integration of these tree systems which support grass productivity in the better areas, and kind of let some areas go wild? And that's really my intention, because we don't have enough sites in Ireland to really understand what bogland succession looks like in the absence of grazing pressure.
Yeah,
it's a bit of an unanswered question,
John. John, what if you had bogland with a stream running through it, and where would you stand on that in terms of, would you be in favour of creating a riparian zone because like bog bank isn't that secure? If there's getting flash floods coming down through it, it could erode the sides of it very easily because there's not a big rooting structure down into it. Would you be in favour of fencing off an area along a bog and maybe letting it regenerate or encouraging it to regenerate in trees, or would you just leave it as it is?
Yeah, like in the right context, in the right situation, I would be in favour of helping it along, for sure. But it wouldn't involve a digger, and it wouldn't involve mound or pit planting, not at all. In a scenario like, I guess before I answer fully, you've got to understand that not all bogland is equal. So you have some land that has become bog through men basically messing up the local water cycle over generations. When you stagnate the water cycle, you create acidic conditions. You get this shift in grassland communities into this unpalatable triangular rough sedges and grasses, and then everything stagnates, and then eventually you get this juvenile bog formation. But that's only there that's only occurring because of the absence of trees. So in that scenario, where we're looking at bank stabilization, I would look at certainly removing grazing pressure and considered planting. So that would be like staking willows, or it would be the introduction of some local alder or really early pioneer species, and not full.
You answered my question there with that next question.
Yeah, for sure. Like I would just.
No, I mean, sorry. You answered my next question. Was going to say in terms of what species you would plant. So that's that you've answered that one for me before I asked it. Good man, John. We are getting close on time there now. So these students are going to have to vacate and go to their next class because they have one timetable straight after this, as do myself. But any questions at all from the class now before we go, or are you happy enough with everything you've seen there? You're very quiet on a Friday.
Silence is consent.
Happy out, yeah, that's fair enough. Happy enough, Holly says, yeah. Right, that's perfect. So, right, On behalf of myself, John, and of the class, I'd like to thank you again for giving us that presentation and that insight. It's great to get a different perspective, get them a chance to hear from somebody else other than myself. But appreciate your insight and your experience and your ongoing study, and maybe if it's not COVID and if you have time, some stage we will get a group out to visit your site and see it firsthand, these principles in action.
That'd be
But
brilliant.
in the
Yeah.
meantime,
More
thank
than
you very
welcome.
much, John.
Lovely. Thank you for the invite.